As of 2025, South Africa has 21 national parks. These parks protect a wide range of ecosystems from deserts and savannas to forests and coastlines, and they are all equally beautiful. To name a few, there's Otto Elephant National Park, famous for elephants. It also includes marine conservation. And then there's Table Mountain National Park, located in Cape Town. It includes Table Mountain and Cape Point. But Kruger National Park is South Africa's crown jewel. It stretches across nearly 20,000 square kilometers of South African wilderness that includes countless animals including the Big Five, which are lions, leopards, elephants, rhinos, and buffaloes. Because of this, it would be the biggest tourist attraction in South Africa. It annually pulls 1.5 million visitors, and among these millions was a 59-year-old grandpa. He was a grandfather from the town of Mankado in Mpumalanga, traveling with his two grandchildren, an 11-year-old and a 5-year-old. He had brought them to the park for a peaceful visit, a chance to show them elephants and other animals and their natural habitat. They arrived first near Malawi Gate, a southern entry point into the park, popular for its river views and elephant sightings. It wasn't very far from the reception area, just over a low bridge and into a lightly wooded stretch of land. But what they didn't know was that an elephant herd was actually nearby, and one of the bulls had already taken notice of them. At some point, according to witness accounts and park officials, the children stepped a little further into the bush, just beyond the standard tourist viewing path. Maybe for a better view, maybe just from innocent curiosity, but whatever the case, that was when a bull elephant separated slightly from the rest of the herd and took a few steps toward them. At first, it would have seemed like nothing. A slow walk, ears fanning, and dust kicking up with each step. And then it broke into a charge. The elephant roared forward, its pace exploding into a sprint that few expect from something so massive, and within seconds, it was barreling through the underbrush, head low, trunk curled slightly in aggression. The sound of branches snapping, hooves hammering the ground, and its deep growl must have filled the air like thunder. The older child grabbed the younger one's hand and screamed. They ran. They ran toward their grandfather, who was now yelling at them to come back, to get behind him, and they did. But that's also when the grandfather, acting on instinct, placed himself directly between his grandchildren and the charging elephant. And not surprising, the elephant would hit him. Not just with its trunk, which alone is powerful enough to lift trees, but with its entire body. The force threw him backward, smashing him into the ground. Then it trampled him, not once, not twice, but over and over. The kids would describe the sounds as bones snapping like dry branches, the thudding of the elephant's legs coming down repeatedly with gruesome rhythm. The elephant's trunk lashed out at him and whipped across the torso, tearing through cloth and skin like paper. His ribcage caved, his face was crushed, one leg was shattered at the femur, nearly torn from the hip. Part of his shoulder was later described as being flattened beyond recognition. And to make it all worse, he was still alive for part of it. The children were paralyzed with shock just feet away, watched it unfold. They were too young to understand what their eyes were showing them, too close to be spared the image. They screamed until their throats went raw. The older grandchild, trying to cover the younger one, suffered injuries to the leg during the fall and scramble. But neither of them were touched by the elephant again. After nearly 30 seconds of violence, the elephant paused. Then, for reasons no one could determine, it stopped. Perhaps the rage had passed, but slowly it turned and ambled back toward the trees, silent, unhurried. By the time park rangers and emergency personnel arrived, he was already gone. His body was beyond saving and nearly beyond recognition. Large patches of skin were torn off, his abdomen was collapsed inward, blood and tissue soaked the grass in the wide radius. The children were taken away immediately. The 11-year-old was treated for a deep laceration on the leg. The 5-year-old was miraculously unharmed, though both were deeply traumatized. Officials were swift to launch an internal investigation. Due to the number of elephants in the area and the confusion of the scene, that specific bull responsible could never be identified. There would be no culling and no punishment. It had happened within the animal's natural space, triggered by what it likely perceived as an encroachment. An inquest was opened not just to document the event, but to underscore the warning that Kruger, while open to the public, remains a wild and untamed place. Tourists are repeatedly cautioned never to exit their vehicles and never to approach animals under any circumstances, not for a better photo or not for a closer look. In the early hours of a quiet June morning in 2020, the city of Palmade, California was still. The sun had not risen yet. In Poncitlán Square, a small public park directly across from Palmade City Hall, sat empty and dimly lit. It was the kind of place people usually pass through during the day, never giving it much thought. But at around 3:30 a.m., a passerby walking through the square noticed something unusual near one of the large trees. In the shadows, a human figure was suspended from a thick, high branch, and the figure wasn't moving. It was Robert Fuller. He was just 24 years old. By 3:39 a.m., emergency responders arrived. Paramedics quickly determined that there were no vital signs and Robert was already dead. He had been hanging from the tree by a red rope, tied tightly around his neck and anchored to a high branch in a way that made it clear that this was no accident. His eyes were partially opened, his tongue protruded slightly, and there were dark bruises forming around his neck where the rope had been pulled and crushed the skin. His face was tinged bluish purple, his lips pale, his body was limp, and rigor mortis had not yet set in, meaning the event had likely occurred not long before discovery. The rope had cut deeply into the flesh under his jaw, leaving a clean, brutal groove. Blood had pooled in his feet and legs, which dangled a few feet off the ground, and insect activity had already begun. He had unfortunately took his own life. Investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived soon after. The scene was secured and quickly escalated due to public sensitivity. Not only was this a hanging death in a public square, it occurred amid national protests against racial injustice and police violence. Just after the incident of George Floyd, this would make the public immediately raise alarms. The image of a young black man hanging from a tree in front of a city hall was not just disturbing, it was deeply symbolic. Was this someone deleting themselves or was it a lynching? The FBI and California Department of Justice joined the investigation. The coroner began a full forensic analysis. Initially, officials were cautious about ruling out any possibilities. Protesters would gather and outrage grew on social media. Robert's family demanded answers and they weren't alone. But as the evidence was gathered, investigators uncovered chilling and heartbreaking details. First, surveillance footage and forensic inspection showed no signs of a struggle. Robert's hands had not been bound, and there were no scratches on his arms or knuckles. There were no signs of restraint, and he had not tried to remove the rope, nor was there any foreign DNA under his fingernails. It was a clean, uninterrupted act. And the rope had been secured from inside the tree, with multiple points of anchor, indicating that the person who tied it had climbed up the tree themselves. And that person was Robert. Records later revealed that he had walked to a Dollar Tree store on May 14th, identical to the one used in the hanging, using his EBT card. The receipt and security footage confirmed the purchase. But see, that's the thing, he bought the rope at a Dollar Tree store, and the knot was, well, he shouldn't have used that knot because it wasn't optimized for a quick loss of consciousness. I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. Since he used that knot, it wasn't an instant death, like he probably thought it was gonna be. In fact, he likely experienced prolonged suffering. The ligature mark was consistent with a static suspension, meaning the body hung and pressure was constant, not a sudden drop. There was no drop involved like in gallows-style executions, so there was no cervical spine fracture, which is typically what causes immediate unconsciousness or death and a long drop hanging. Instead, the method caused asphyxiation. The rope pressed slowly and painfully across his airway and carotid arteries. Fuller likely struggled for air for at least 2 to 6 minutes, and he would have been conscious for part of that time, with panic and suffering present. His tongue was protruding, and his eyes were partially open, further indicating a slow and traumatic death. This form of deleting yourself is unfortunately common among those with limited resources or impulsive mental health crisis, and it often resulted in significant pain and suffering. As the investigation deepened, so did the tragedy. Robert Fuller had a documented history of mental illness. Between 2017 and 19, he had been hospitalized multiple times for the idea of deleting himself. He had told health workers that he heard voices, and he had even attempted to delete himself while trying to set himself on fire. In one report, doctors noted that he had often struggled with feelings of isolation and deep depressive episodes. No note was found near the body, but his online activity, personal items, and mental health history painted a grim picture. Robert had been suffering, privately and quietly, and on that night he chose a very public and irreversible exit. The official autopsy confirmed cause of death was asphyxiation due to hanging. The ligature mark on the neck matched the rope in width and pattern, and there was no defensive wounds. No drugs or alcohol were found in his system. The Los Angeles Medical Examiner ultimately ruled the death as him taking his own life. To be clear, investigators found no signs of foul play. Also, if you are having mental problems, please talk to someone, and I guarantee you taking your own life will not solve any of these problems. The air in rural Malawi was dry that evening, the kind of dusk where the heat had retreated, but the scent of dust and wood smoke still clung to the air. The village of Nathalri, nestled near the edge of Waza Marsh Wildlife Reserve, was quiet. Most families had retreated into their homes for the night with the doors latched, fires dimmed, and children hushed. But Simon Chira, a 31-year-old farmer and father of two, was still out. He had left earlier that afternoon to visit his cousin in a nearby village a few kilometers away. These journeys weren't unusual, in fact they were common among locals. A walk through the bush path and along the reserve's edges, cutting time off the main road. The risk was known, but so was the routine. Most villagers knew the tracks well and had walked them their entire lives. Simon was making his return just after nightfall. Now there was no streetlights to guide him, just the moonlight, flickering through scattered clouds and the distant hum of insects vibrating in the grass. He had only a stick in hand, not uncommon in these areas, used both for support and to ward off wild dogs, snakes, or the occasional baboon. But he didn't know he was being watched. Several kilometers from home, near a bend in the narrow path through the brush, the grass stirred. What emerged from the thicket was not one, but two adult hyenas, large and brazen. These were spotted hyenas, creatures with powerful jaws, capable of crushing bone, and known to scavenge but also to hunt when desperate. And trust me, they were desperate. Over the past year, worsening droughts had pushed wildlife deeper into human settlements. Elephants trampled crops, lions had taken livestock, and the hyenas, and growing more fearless, had taken to following people. Now Simon may have noticed them, he might have turned around and shouted, waved his stick, but hyenas are patient predators. One might have lunged while the other circled, but by the time the screaming began, there was no one near enough to hear him. The first bite shattered Simon's lower leg, teeth puncturing through bone and muscle. He fell, still fighting, clawing at the dirt, swinging his stick wildly, but it was no use. The second hyena clamped its jaws onto his shoulder, tearing chunks away of his skin. Their tactic was merciless. They began eating him alive without waiting for death. His abdomen was torn open, his intestines pulled out. The hyenas were going for nutrient-rich organs. They knew what they wanted. The liver, the kidneys, and heart are prized by scavengers for the density of vitamins and minerals. The attackers went for them while Simon was still conscious, gasping and choking on blood, and also twitching in the dirt. He likely died minutes later from a combination of blood loss, shock, and excruciating pain. When searchers found his body early the next morning, alerted by his family when he didn't return, it was ripped apart, barely recognizable. His face was mostly intact, but his chest had been crushed in, his ribcage exposed, and his stomach cavity was hollowed out. One arm had been chewed to the bone, his legs, clawed and mangled, were surrounded by drag marks, and blood-soaked earth and vultures had begun to circle. What remained of Simon was buried quickly under heavy emotion and heavier silence. Local authorities confirmed the attack as it wasn't the first, though it was the most brutal in years. In the weeks that followed, people in the area refused to walk at night, and children were kept inside even during dusk, which was smart. The Parks Department launched a patrol, but the damage was done. Wildlife experts issued a statement. Human-wildlife conflict in Malawi was escalating. Droughts were driving animals closer to settlements, and the marsh reserve in particular had become a flashpoint. Illegal poaching had wiped out much of the hyena's natural prey, and now humans had become the easiest target. But for Simon's family, however, this was not an ecological crisis. It was a personal nightmare, a loss so violent that no one in the village could speak of it without unease. His wife, who identified what was left of him by the clothes he wore, collapsed at the burial, and his children still asked why their father never came back. His final moments were not peaceful. They were not quiet, they were violent, drawn out, and terrifying. A man overtaken by beasts dragged into the underbrush and ripped apart limb by limb while still breathing. The skies above Butavia, Brazil, are considered sacred ground by skydivers. Known as the national capital of parachuting, the airspace is busy with daily jumps, often numbering in the hundreds. That weekend in October 2024, the conditions were near perfect: blue skies, manageable winds, and a lively but focused atmosphere on the ground. Carolina Munoz Kennedy, a 40-year-old chiropractor and experienced skydiver, was a familiar face in Butavia's tightly knit skydiving community. She had lived in Brazil for 5 years, logged hundreds of jumps since beginning the sport in 2013, and was a licensed member of the Brazilian Parachuting Confederation. She was known for her discipline and her growing doubts about how long she actually wanted to keep jumping. But that day, Carolina had been part of a group completing multiple jumps. Like I said, she wasn't a beginner. In fact, she often mentored others and exiting on exit positioning, altitude awareness, and body control. This jump, sometime in the afternoon of October, she boarded the plane like always, calm, gear checked, straps secured. She wore a modern rig with an AAD, a main chute, and a reserve. There was nothing visibly wrong with the equipment on the ground. At around 13,000 feet, she jumped. Witnesses on the ground and fellow divers from the plane watched as she entered freefall. Her form was stable. She fell for roughly 45 seconds belly to earth, maintaining a controlled position until she reached deployment altitude around 4,000 feet. She pulled, but the main parachute failed to fully deploy, something later believed to be a line twist or bag lock malfunction, which caused it to partially inflate, then violently collapse. Instead of slowing her descent, it began spinning her mid-air in a destabilized corkscrew motion. Those watching from below saw the chute behind her like tangled fabric in a wind tunnel. She would immediately reach for a cutaway handle, a routine emergency procedure. She pulled it successfully, detaching the main parachute. Now in pure freefall again, she attempted to deploy her reserve. And that's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Her reserve parachute, which should have opened automatically via the AAD, if not manually pulled, malfunctioned as well. Whether the pilot chute failed to extract the reserve properly, or the rig experienced a pilot chute hesitation, has not been fully determined, but what is clear is that the reserve did not deploy in time. What opened, if at all, was far too little and far too late. She was now falling uncontrollably at a terminal velocity about 200 kilometers per hour, and the impact was instantaneous and devastating. She hit the ground feet first but slightly tilted, causing her body to snap backward violently. Her legs shattered, the femurs breaking through skin, her pelvis was crushed from the sheer vertical compression, and the force surged upward, causing massive internal bleeding, tearing through major organs including her liver and spleen. Her ribcage exploded inward, piercing her lungs and heart. Her spine fractured in multiple places, with bone fragments driven into the spinal cord and surrounding muscle, according to the on-site medical team. But even before they arrived, bystanders knew there was no surviving what they had just seen. Her helmet was still on, her eyes were closed, blood poured around her crushed torso and lower limbs. Her jumpsuit had been split in areas where the bones had burst outward. A long red streak marked the place of initial impact in her final stop. A crowd quickly formed, but silence hung heavy. In a sport where injuries happened, a double parachute failure is one of the most feared and rare events. Carolina's incident was caught on camera by nearby skydivers and helmet cams, but was not made public. Though the footage did show the failed main, the chaotic spin, and the long haunting fall with no working canopy, the Brazilian Parachuting Confederation and police launched an investigation. The equipment was seized, witnesses were interviewed, and early results pointed to a freak coincidence of failures. A main chute that didn't fully open, a reserve that either failed to extract or tangled, and the odds were a lot, but not impossible. Carolina's remains were cremated on October 30th, and her ashes were attended by friends and family who flew in from Chile and Brazil.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.